Hi everybody, thanks for coming today. My name is Jeremy Druin, and I'll talk a little bit today about our adventures with a cipher called the Visionaire Cipher. And a little bit about myself. Do security penetration testing most of the time. Also work on application security and application testing, mobile device testing, and some other forms of pen testing as well. Mostly do networks. And also work on a couple of projects. Matilda, a open source web application security project, and the project I'm going to talk about today, which is to help people get started in learning the classical cryptography ciphers. So to start with, we'll look at a couple of basic cipher primitives. So we have a cipher, and what it's going to do is it's going to take some kind of what we call plain text. That's the unencrypted information. We're going to run that through the cipher machine, and it's going to generate ciphertext, which is the encrypted text that supposedly is unreadable. So a couple of basic mechanisms. We have the substitution cipher, and we also have transposition cipher. And the substitution is just basically trading out one character for another. So these are both pretty simple, but substitution is really easy to understand. So for example, if I have a deck of cards, and I take like all the kings, so say I have a bunch of kings in the deck, and then I switch those out, and for every time you have a king, you're going to replace those with the sevens. And so now this deck is physically different than it was before because all the kings got switched out for the sevens. That's substitution. You can think of switching the letter A for the letter Z, or something along those lines would be a similar analogy to changing your deck to not have any kings, but instead have sevens in their places. So in the transposition, what you're doing is you're actually shuffling the deck. You're not changing any of the characters that were in the original plain text, but you are permuting them or moving them around. So with the substitution cipher, we got 4 basic different types, and they're all kind of variations of each other. And then transposition, basically you just have permutation or shuffling. And so the first simple cipher, substitution cipher, is the simple substitution cipher, aptly named. And that's the one that's just doing a shift a certain number of characters. So as an example, here we have the most trivial of all substitution ciphers. The key is 1. And so every letter that you have in the plain text, we're just going to shift it exactly 1 spot. So the H in hello went to I, and E went to F, and so on and so forth. But one of the things to notice here is that check out the 2 L's in the word hello and the 1 L in the word world. Notice that they all encrypt to the letter M. Because with the simple substitution cipher, you're applying the exact same key to every single column. This makes this cipher fairly easy to break. If you do a frequency analysis on any language, there's going to be a most popular character. So English, the letter E is very popular, a little more than 12% of the time, very popular. And if you look at JPEGs that we're going to look at today, byte 0 is very popular, comes up, again, more than almost 2% of the time, which is a lot. And so what you do to break the cipher is just find the most common character in your ciphertext, assume that that would be your most popular letter in the plain text, and subtract the 2, and that should be your key. Now, the next level up is the polyalphabetic cipher. So the polyalphabetic cipher is as if you're doing a simple substitution cipher to every column of the plain text. Much harder to break, and in fact, this cipher was military grade for a number of years. Roughly the 1600s to the 1900s. It was used by several different militaries successfully, some not so successfully, and eventually it was broken by the Americans right around the World War II, World War I time frame, right around in there. And the way this one works is, again, you have a key for the first column, and you have a key for the second column, and a key for the third column, and they can be different keys. So you don't end up getting that pattern that we saw before as bad, where all the letter E's ended up being, letter F's, and so the F turned out to be the most common letter. It tends to flatten that out. In the example here, we have the word aardvark, and it starts with 2 letter A's. but you'll notice that it encrypted to B and C respectively because the first key is the number 1 and the second key is the number 2 in this example here. So if we apply that to our hello world example from earlier, we'll just make the key 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you'll notice that now the E goes to G and the L goes to N. And notice that the 3 L's, they ended up being 3 different values. And so you have the cipher repeating as well. So notice carefully that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we run out of characters in our password, and we have to start over at the letter or number 1 to go to the next word in world. A couple of others just to kind of complete the substitution ciphers. We have polygrams, which are popular in modern ciphers, things like AES and other ciphers that you'd be familiar with in today's world, 21st century. And these are used, the way these are used is you replace an entire word with a whole nother word. And so you might add up all the letters in your block and get a total value and then add the password to that total value as an aggregate. And these are much harder to break because it obfuscates that pattern of popular letters, popular characters really well. And then the one-time pad is the ultimate. Here your password is just as long, if not longer, than the plain text you're encrypting. And these, when used properly, are unbreakable. Technically, the cipher we're going to talk about today, the Visionary, which is polyalphabetic, could be turned into a one-time pad. You would just have to make the password as long as the plain text itself. So transposition, again, just simply scrambling the letters. You're not changing anything out. And Visionary does not have any transposition properties to it, but certainly your modern ciphers are going to combine the polygram with the transposition and come up with a much better cipher. So where do we start? Well, one of the first things I did when I was learning this was I tried to write some code that would implement these classical cryptography ciphers just to help me understand it a little bit better. And so with that, I wrote Shifty and Affinity, which are substitution ciphers. And then the one we're going to look at today, the Visionary, is implemented by the Visionary. And then I did Polygram with the Hilarity. And that implements a Hill cipher, which is a polygram. So another thing I worked on was some utilities. The frequency analyzer is called freak.py. And so that one is going to help us break the cipher. Oh, okay. All right, we'll restart here. Okay. So we'll start with breaking some stuff. So why did I pick the Visionary cipher? Well, it's actually a little bit difficult to break, especially if you're new to cryptography and cryptanalysis and things like that. But it's not impossible. It's something that is within reach of folks that are not professional cryptographers. It's harder than a substitution cipher because you're not going to be able to pick on the most popular letter and work your way backwards from there as easily, since it's more obfuscated, because we said that the different columns have different keys, so that most popular letter is going to tend to be broken up a little bit. So basically, the way that we got set up was we encrypted some JPEG files, and in the exercise that we were doing before, we actually had partners where each person encrypted a picture and then with a password, and then you traded pictures and tried to break each other's picture. And that's a pretty good way to kind of practice this stuff and see if you can do it. So a little quick side note. One of the things we're not really talking about much is how would you know that the encrypted information is English email or it's a picture of based in JPEG or PNG, or other format. Well, that actually is the realm of doing meta-analysis or traffic analysis. And in that, you're very interested in who's talking to who and what they're talking about, the context of the situation. And certainly, this has a lot in common with folks that work in like a security operations, very interested in, even if they can't understand what's going on as far as, is this command and control beaconing back, just the fact that something's happening exactly every 60 seconds to an IP that's halfway around the world, that in and of itself is information that's useful. And it's that kind of analysis is how we would figure out that this was a JPEG or whatever the actual file format was. So we'll start with, we're going to look at just plain text JPEGs. In other words, these are not encrypted. We just want to understand what does a JPEG look like. In other words, how would you know like that byte 0 is the most popular byte in a JPEG unless you actually looked at some JPEGs. So we'll use some statistical analysis. These are just ordinary stats that I'm sure you've seen before. We have different kinds of averages, mean, median, mode. Mean being the most average of all averages, right? And then you have your Shannon entropy histograms, which are useful in figuring out if something's actually encrypted or not. Because sometimes you're looking at gibberish coming across the wire and you don't even know if it's even encrypted. So it could just be obfuscated or base64 encoded or something like that. So these are the pictures that I used, and I intentionally picked one picture that wasn't like the others so that I could do a little bit of, the fancy word is differential analysis, but in plain English we just look at what's different. And so I ran the statistics on it using the Python program called freak.py that was in that GitHub package. And for example, these are the different commands you can use. And one of the things I did as a quick note is I took every command that's in this presentation plus all kinds of other examples, and I posted them on the GitHub site along with all of this code so that not only do you have the code there, but you have step-by-step examples right on the README that you can follow or even just copy and paste if you want. Additionally, the actual pictures used in this presentation, I put those in the test files folder on the GitHub as well. So literally everything is there to recreate all of this right there in one spot. And I'll show that GitHub at the end here again. So the first thing we did is started with FunnyCat1 and just ran some stats. Now, first thing I wanted you to notice that byte 0 is by far the dominant byte. 394 occurrences in this particular file, and second place is only 204 characters of, or 220 characters of byte 204. So it's really a distant second, right? It's not even close. The other statistical measures were pretty average, and so they weren't super helpful, but the mode most populous was, of course, byte 0. And this trend continued. On the second picture of the cat, it's a little bit different, 1.76% with zeros, still very dominant. Third picture, again, 0 was very dominant. And then when we got to the fourth picture, Larry Bird actually broke the mold because Larry Bird had the most popular of byte 32, that's space. But what's interesting is that the byte 0 was second place still. And so the numbers are way off too. Like notice that the byte 32 is the 8.63%, and then the byte 0 is 7.76. So even though byte 0 came in second place, it's actually a much larger portion of the file respectively than it was even in the ones where byte 0 got first place. So all in all, we know that byte 0 is basically going to show up in JPEGs a lot. If you actually go read the specifications on the JPEG, what you'll back into is that the 0 is the line terminator. So kind of think of it as like when you're writing an email and you're hitting the enter key a lot, the line break, that's going to be popular in your file. JPEG uses the 0 to end its segments so that you know that you're starting a new segment. And that's what makes it popular. So here is all those statistics boiled down into easy to read chart. And the thing that we notice the most is that mode is 0 the vast majority of the time. And even when the 32 beat out 0 by just a little bit, 0 was still extremely popular in these files. So that's our takeaway. Byte 0 is effectively our letter E for our purposes in this study. So now we look at the actual JPEG files after they've been encrypted. And again, we kind of bust out the math. And so we encrypted the FunnyCat1, runs the statistics on FunnyCat1, and then we're going to compare those statistics against the stats we just ran on the plain files and see what kind of differences there are between the two. And then if that doesn't work, we'll just try a different JPEG and see if we can learn from that. Again, the commands that were used are all up on the GitHub site, but the idea is basically you can encrypt a file with Visionary to do Visionary encryption, and then we can run the statistics with the frequency analyzer freak.py. So just as a reminder, recall that the Visionary cipher had a different key for each letter, but remember how the key repeated. See, we ran out of key letters, and we still had more plain text to go, so we had to start all over at the beginning and start using the first key character and the second key character all over again for the word world in this example that gave us the ciphertext. So remembering the key is repeated, every key length is, well, key. No pun intended. So another statistic that we ran, remember we ran the statistics before and after we did the encryption, right? And so one of the things that we notice is there's actually mathematical proof that Vision Error is doing a good job at smoothing out those really popular characters. So one of the stats is the mode count ratio, and basically that sounds fancy, but the way it works is if I told you that JPEGs are made up of 256 characters, all else being equal, on average, you would figure, well, I guess any particular character should show up about 1 in 256 times, right? You know, on average, if everything was even. And in this case, what we see is that the mode count ratio was actually 2.64, so it's not 1-to-1. It's actually, the mode count ratio is way off. It's really, really high on the unencrypted files. But it dropped all the way to 1.36 on the encrypted files. So Vision Error is actually taking it from like 164% overage to down to a 36% overage. So it is, in fact, smoothing things out. Visually speaking, you can get a look at this in a histogram. It's telling us the same thing. Notice the mode 0 on the left is really spiky, and on the right-hand side, it had a tendency to kind of smooth that out a little bit and spread those zeros out more evenly across the ciphertext. But the fact that it only got it down to about a 36% overage, in the world of cryptography, that's really bad, because that means that there is a difference and we can detect it. And you want your ciphers to be constructed in such a way that the ciphertext is just perfectly even. There's exactly the same number of A's, same number of B's, same number of C's, same number of exclamation point, and so on. You want everything to be perfectly even. Otherwise, somebody can pick on that difference. So now we'll take a look at the actual ciphertext. So in our trivial example, we made a couple of notes. We noted that byte 0 occurs a lot. We note the key repeats, every time the key runs out. We don't know how long the key is if we just pick a random password and you all were to trade files and try to break each other's encryption. But we know it's going to repeat unless the ciphertext is just, really super short, right? Or the key is extremely long, like in a one-time pad. So one of the things we can do to actually break this is, what we'll do is we'll look at the words in the ciphertext. If you think of the ciphertext as being a one really long giant word that just has, constant stream. So if every key length, if we take those words in the ciphertext and we just move them down under each other to create a big giant column, okay, of ciphertext where everything in the first column, in this case the red, is encrypted with the first key character, and everything in the second column is encrypted with the second key character. So we're grouping the letters in the ciphertext, we're grouping them together by which key they were encrypted with. Well, at that point, we've just got nothing but a substitution cipher on each column. Now, we'll have to break the first column independent of the second column, independent of the third column, because each column has its own key, right? But it's still a fairly simple problem that we talked about at the very beginning, is we're just breaking this substitution cipher for the first column, and then we're going to break the second substitution cipher for the second column and work our way through it. And when we get to the end of the key, then we're done, and we'll have the password recovered. And just to give you some background, when I was working on this, originally the reason was I was in the middle of a pen test, and there was some source code that was actually encrypted with a Vision Error cipher. And I ran into it in real life. And the password that they used was, I think it was about 32, 33 characters long, if I remember right. And it didn't matter, because think about it, we're breaking one column independently at a time. So we can just do a simple substitution cipher break on the first column and then move to the second column. The fact that we had to do it 32 times, is a little bit of a hassle, right? But it really wasn't that big a deal as far as breaking the file. It took about 4 hours to figure out from the time that we got the file to the time that we had broken the file was about a 4-hour stretch, which is really fast in terms of breaking ciphers and stuff like that. So, big problem. How are we going to figure out how long that key is? Because everything hinges on knowing how long the key is and then breaking the ciphertext apart into groups of n, where n is the key length. So we're going to have to fix that problem or we're going nowhere. So one of the fellows that worked on breaking the cipher originally, Friedman, he worked for the United States, and he did some work in breaking these codes in a military setting. And one of the things he figured out was, well, if we could figure out how many doubles there were in the ciphertext when we checked different key lengths, we should notice a difference. Oh, thank you.
That one probably work better. Okay. And then we'll sit the same way aside. Sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Put it back just because I gotta know what adapter it is within your mind. I gotta see what that is on it.
Awesome. Okay, so he came up with this formula here, and basically what it does is it looks real fancy and everything, but it just counts doubles. A and B are variables, and they're just representing the first letter, the second letter, the first letter, the third letter, the first letter, the fourth letter, the first letter, the fifth letter. You know, we're just comparing and counting. So a little bit more of a visual representation. Let's say, for example, in our fun little Hello World example, that I moved I made a copy of the ciphertext, okay? And I put the copy underneath of the first copy. And I moved it over one spot. So on the left-hand side, I moved it over one spot. We're going to compare the G to the I, the N to the G, O to the N. Sounds like a song I've heard before. And then you go to the second example, and I've moved the ciphertext over 2 positions relative to itself. And then we compare the letters again. Again, we're counting doubles. See if you see any doubles. And then in the third example, I've moved it over 3 spaces and so on. Why am I doing that? Why am I moving this over, one little space at a time? Well, the idea is that we're going to count these doubles, and we're going to count on the fact that if we get the shift just right, so that we've shifted over key length number of characters, or n number of characters, where n is the key length, what's going to happen is suddenly there's going to be a lot more doubles. So this slide explains it, but let me try a visual that I think can actually help it a little bit better, and then you can look at the slide later for reference. So, okay, so we have some dice here, and these dice have the letters of the alphabet on them. Okay, so that's going to represent your ciphertext. And so maybe the left-hand die is the first letter, and then maybe the second die is the 7th letter. Because you're going to keep shifting it over, right? One spot at a time. You're going to keep doing this experiment over and over and over again. One shift at a time. So to get the first letter in the top row, you roll the dice and, it comes up to some letter. We'll say it comes up to X, right? So let's say that we roll the second dice and we get an X. Okay? That would be considered doubles. It's 2 X's. Okay? Now, for that to happen with the keys being different keys, kind of be a little bit of a relative miracle, right? Because this first letter was encrypted with its key. Let's say that the green die represents the key. I know it's a lame password. It's only 6 characters. Don't do this in real life. It's not compliant, but just for fun. Okay? So we had to roll a 6 to get the X. All right? That means that to get the X over here, we would have had to have rolled a 6 also on the key for that second dice, right? You have to get lucky, and you have to have a password like password that has 2 S's in it, and the S's represent the 6 or something like that. It just has to be the luck, okay? Now, what are the chances? Well, the chance of getting the 2 X's, period, okay, is 1 in 26 times 1 in 26. We agree because there's 26 letters in the alphabet, and there's only 1 X, okay? And we got to do it twice. Then you got to add in the fact I had to get 2 6s. So what's the chance of getting doubles on these super short password dice? Well, again, 6 doubles that I could have gotten out of 36 possible combinations, so 1/6. So, you got to take the 1 in 26 times that, which is like, 1 in 600, give or take, and then you got to multiply that times 1/6. So now you're talking like a 1 in 3,600 chance of actually hitting doubles in this ciphertext. Not a great chance. But what if I could guarantee you, what if I could promise you that these dice here, what if I could promise you they're always going to come up doubles? It's always going to be the same key. Guaranteed. Well, the chances just got a lot better, right? Now we're back down to 1 in 26 times 1 in 26, which is like, 1 in 600-ish. And so, well, things are looking up, right? That's way better. That's 6 times more likely that we're going to get doubles if you take the key out of the picture. Well, when is the key out of the picture? The key is out of the picture when you get the key length right. When you're moving those lines under one another, they're going to line up perfectly. All right, so those 2 slides kind of explain that, but the idea is to get the letters to line up exactly perfectly. So if we look at a kind of a very trivial example here, I lined up 1 shift on the left, 2 shifts in the middle, and 3 shifts on this made-up ciphertext, that gibberish that we have here. And what we ended up seeing is that the middle one, we actually got 3 doubles out of 9 tries. The right-hand one only got 1 double out of 8 tries, and the left one only got 2 doubles out of 10 tries, right? So the first one's really, really bad. The reason it's 10, 9, 8 is, remember, every time you shift over, you're losing a comparison, right? Because you're dropping the first letter off. So we would definitely say in this case, the key length must be 3 characters, because how else would we have gotten so many more doubles than we expected to get based on the other 2 samples? Now, of course, these are very small samples and very trivial examples, and they make for good demo and good talk. But in real life, it's much more complicated because you have much bigger passwords, much bigger alphabets, much bigger plain text and ciphertext, right? So the actual formula to figure it out is this monstrosity here, and it comes from the book by Stinson that I learned most of this from. And so basically what it just says is we have to take into account the probability of getting a certain letter. We called that X in our experiment, and the variable is actually X on the board. And then the probability of getting a certain key, we use the green dice to represent getting a certain key. And then you have to do that for every possible way to end up getting the ciphertext. So what we find out with English alphabet, now when I say the English alphabet here, I'm talking about lowercase letters A through Z, again, as a simplification for the argumented discussion. And so what we end up finding out is if you have a different key, we have to roll the green dice, and we have no idea if we're going to get a match, okay? That what you're going to find out is you're going to get doubles about 0.038% of the time. And so, not great. If the same key is used, in other words, if you shift the letters over and you get the columns to align, what you're going to find out is that the chances jump astronomically in the world of stats anyway, to 0.065. Now, 0.065 is a lousy chance, admittedly, but it's double the chance of getting doubles if you don't get the columns aligned properly, if you haven't guessed the key length correctly. So, although it's a lousy chance, it's still vastly different, statistically speaking, than the chance if you don't get the columns aligned right. Well, as you might imagine, this is a tremendous pain, right? So, we'll just let the computer do it. Seriously. That's a lot of work. All right, so I will go over here to the this Windows box where I got some of this Python running, and so I'll run this command for you that does the IOC, the index of coincidence that Friedman brought. And look what ends up happening when we run it on our cat file. So we have a spike at 8, and we have a spike at 16, and a spike at 24. And if you were to read on down, you're going to notice it's going to be 32 and 40 and so on and so forth. And of course, what we have in common here is it's a multiple of 8, right? So every time we shift over exactly 8 spots, suddenly, we hit the Yahtzee and everything comes up roses, right? And everything is double. Now, again, they're not good odds. It's 1.87%. But graphically speaking, you can see, even though it's a relatively small number, the fact that the numbers are so different is what stands out. And visually, we can really notice how different those numbers are. So let's just assume that our key length is probably 8 characters long. So now we know how long this key is. And the next part is we're going to take the ciphertext, and in this case, instead of using the trivial hello world, this is the actual ciphertext of FunnyCat1 encrypted with a certain password. And we're going to break it up into blocks of 8. And we're going to take those blocks of 8 and we're going to line them up underneath of one another like we said we were going to do. Because that way, all those numbers over there on the first column were encrypted with the first letter of the password. Second column with the second letter of the password. I should say character, it may not be a letter. And so on and so forth. Obviously, we stop at 8 because it's an 8-character password. So, again, very tedious. We should probably let the computer do this. So we'll run another command, which basically does the, breaks it up into columns of 8. I had to put the 8 in there, so I had to learn the index coincidence first, and then bring that number back in here and plug it in, and put in 8, and then give the computer the file. And then when I run this analysis, it's going to work on one column at a time, like we said, and it's going to say, hey, the byte 17 was by far the most popular in our file for the first column, okay? So the computer says, well, I'll just subtract 0 from that. It's probably right. And it gives us the letter R. And then byte 14 is by far the most popular for the second column. And so it says, I'll just guess that that's an O. And it repeats this process for all 8 columns. So what we end up getting is ROCKY329. And as it turns out, you would then take that password and you would go over to the file and you would give it a try, right? And see if you can decrypt it. And sure enough, that would work. Now, of course, this analysis is case insensitive again. So what you might run into is you might say, well, lowercase Rocky329, it didn't work. And you'd be bummed out and think everything's, terrible again. Well, again, remember that what do people do? At the end of the day, people are always people. And so think about it. The variations could be, capital O or capital Y, but they're not going to be, right? It's either going to be lowercase Rocky329 or uppercase 32 Rocky329, or it's going to be capital R and then all lowercase and then 329. So you just try all 3 of those variations. What you would find is the first variation worked. All right, and then we saw this on the picture. And so basically this is the command to guess the columns, the key being the call command, COL, to give it 8, obviously because we knew it was an 8-character password from our earlier analysis, and the G is guess. And so how do we actually make this a little bit better? Well, JPEG is easy to break because it only has one mode. It's not multimodal like English language is. And so you can just kind of pick on the byte 0 and sort of depend on that. Larry Bird would have thrown you off a little bit, and so you would have to have gone to the second mode, which was 0 in the Larry Bird case, the Twitter bird. But otherwise, worked really well, and it turned out to be a really nice example to get started on. The file that we were working on was source code, and it did require a little more analysis and a little bit more curve fitting, because we had to count on the fact that, again, the letter E is probably the most popular. Then we had to account for the letter T being the second most and the letter A being the third most. And so we sort of had to take into account this idea that there's going to be a little bit more of curve fitting going on. And adding that into the Python would have made it a lot better of a real-life example. So just in full disclosure on that. So I'd like to open it up to any kind of questions that you all have on anything related to this. Yes? Mm-hmm. Right. You did mention DES. So DES is actually much more difficult to break, and you have to use different kinds of attacks, like meet in the middles or birthdays and stuff like that, because it's a modern cipher. But like the double visionary that you mentioned, you would end up somehow you would have to have the insight or just the sheer willpower to actually run this analysis twice, guessing that maybe that's what they actually did. Now, you know what? If you didn't know, if in a vacuum, I don't even know if anybody would really have that much insight unless they were just kind of a professional code breaker. But I think that's where that metadata analysis or that traffic analysis comes in. Somehow or another, you would need to learn from your adversary that that's what they were doing, that was their practice. And then once you knew that they were doing double vision error, you would simply do this 2 times in a row. So going back to the metadata would be important. Yes? What type of what again? Oh, he asked what type of cryptography were they using. How do you know? Metadata analysis or traffic analysis from the one slide. You would need to study your adversary. You need to do, if you couldn't do traffic analysis, you could also do just reconnaissance. So you end up learning more about them. Maybe you go out to their LinkedIn and everybody there has the skill of visionary cipher person, right? Or you study them and you find out that, oh my gosh, they use like Red Hat servers like all the time. Like I've never seen anything but Red Hat around that place. Or they, maybe you learn that they use DES all the time, and that's all they ever use because they're under some kind of restriction with compliance, and they're a bank, and they're not allowed, you're not allowed to use anything different even though they know better. So you have to learn about the situation, the context, the adversary. You have to have that situational awareness to put the pieces together. And just a little off topic, but I can just let you know in pen testing, that's really one of the most important steps, the reconnaissance and the scanning portions, the very upfront portions. I mean, other than actual writing the report itself, which is what you're really getting paid for, those two early phases, even though they're not the cool and sexy, that's where you really make your money, is learning this context. It makes everything else down the road possible. It makes all the exploits possible. Yes? Blue team would use the same techniques, but I think in this context, blue team might be like a security operations or something like that, and they're probably using like Wireshark or some kind of SIM tool or some sort of traffic analysis tool that they've purchased, depending on how big of a shop they are. And so they would just have to have the actual same set of skills to recognize, hey, when I run the statistics on this traffic, I'm noticing this about the mode, the median, the mean. I'm noticing this about the histogram, the Shannon entropy, and some other statistics. And that pattern or profile fits the pattern of what AES looks like. So like if you actually look at AES, say 256, really great cipher, you'll notice that the histogram is just perfect. I mean, it's like a work of art. It's, it's like everything is perfectly even, and that's kind of a characteristic of that cipher, right? In Visionary, when we did the mode count analysis, we noticed that the ratio reduction was good, but it wasn't perfect, right? There was a 36% of, the mode was off by 36% on that first character, and so that's kind of a signature, if you will. And so, again, the professionals would kind of recognize this stuff. And full disclosure, I'm not there. I can't break modern ciphers, anything that's, really strong or really good. And so that is beyond me as far as how you would break those. But the idea of how do you recognize it, I think is you're just looking for the pattern or the signature in the statistics. All right. Any other questions? All right. Thanks very much. I'll leave my contact information up here. And if you would like the GitHub, so this weaponized my handle, that is my GitHub account as well. So if you go to GitHub and go to that account, there's only one project, and it's this project that's under that handle. All right, thank you very much.